Buenas tardes a todos y todas ustedes al Fórum del Instituto de Geografía, primer semestre. Hoy tenemos el honor de contar con nosotros con el doctor Mark Kerr de la Universidad de Arizona, con quien el instituto una universidad con la que el instituto está empezando a tener intercambios a través de estas pláticas. Y desde luego, bienvenidos a quienes nos acompañan en el auditorio del Instituto de Geografía y a quienes están acompañándonos en la transmisión en vivo a través de YouTube y de Facebook del Instituto de Geografía. El doctor Mark Kerr va a hablar en inglés, va a hacer su presentación en inglés, y yo voy a leer su semblanza también en inglés por cortesía con nuestro invitado. Dr. Mark Kerr is an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development and Environment at the University of Arizona. His research explores the variegated landscape of experimentation in the financial borderscapes of urban development, housing, and consumer finance. His work can be found in Antipode, Urban Geography, the Journal of Cultural Economy, Geoforum, Economic Geography, Economy and Society, Competition and Change, and a variety of other places, including opinions in the popular press. While Mark's degrees are all from Canada, where he was born, he got his PhD from Simon Fraser University, Vancouver, and the University of Toronto. He has lived and worked in the United States for nearly a decade. His research focuses on three overlapping areas, including one, the role of financial markets and products in the regulation of poverty in advanced capitalist societies. Two, the financing of urban development and climate adaptation and mitigation, as well as three, housing vulnerability and insecurity. What unifies these three areas of research is an interest in the development and reform of financial markets to ameliorate inequalities related to reduced state funding for housing, welfare, and urban development, and the associated redistribution of responsibility and risk to municipalities and individual households. This emphasis on financial innovation and the development of new markets has drawn his attention to the edges of the financial system, to places and people for whom credit is scarce. Dr. Kerr describes these financial market peripheries as financial borderscapes, growing zones where new risks and uncertainties are managed through improvised repertoires of financial products and practices that map poorly onto traditional binary categories of mainstream and fringe, formal and informal, public and private. So this is Mark Kerr, and he's going to speak about real property supremacy and the production of climate vulnerability. Dr. Kerr.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Azuela, and thank you to Elena Guzman as well for helping to coordinate my visit. I'm very sad that I can't be there with you in person, and I also apologize that I can't engage with UNAM and the geography department in Spanish. But believe me, I'm doing you a favor by not trying. So please bear with me, and my sincere apologies that us English speakers are often not as linguistically adaptable as folks from other parts of the world. So I'm just going to share my screen here. I'm going to share it again. Okay, can everyone see that? Is that my my presentation is clearly up on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you for that introduction again, Luz. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about really two papers today that are related, but I'm going to be connecting them in a way that I'm sort of yet to formally connect them. So I'm working on a paper that's trying to bring together some work on this concept of real property supremacy that's under review right now, and another project on what I'm calling home thermal security, which is essentially an analysis of the thermal environments that people experience in their homes here in the desert Southwest. And to bring these sort of together is what I'm going to try to do for you today. So here's the plan of my talk. So my main object of study over the past 3 years has been manufactured or mobile housing, which is a somewhat unique form of housing in the context of the United States, to a lesser extent in Canada, Australia. I'm actually not quite sure of its prevalence in Mexico, but I'm going to give a little bit of background just so you're all familiar with this type of housing. It's generally considered to be a very stigmatized form of housing that's associated with low-income populations, but it's also a very important part of the affordable housing mix in the United States, especially in the Sun Belt, so the southern states. And then I'm going to introduce this idea of real property supremacy, which is to sort of suggest that the marginalization of manufactured housing is not entirely about its inadequacies or the ways in which it has been made deficient in law and policy, but also about the elevation of other forms of real estate, namely real property. Okay, so and I'll provide some definitions there too. And then I want to sort of bring together this idea of real property supremacy with hazard vulnerability, and specifically a climate vulnerability and vulnerability to extreme heat. And then I'll have some concluding thoughts that will hopefully synthesize some of this for all of you. Okay, so what is a manufactured home? This is a bit of an esoteric definition, but it matters. So a manufactured home in the United States is a factory-built home, so a home that is built in a factory almost entirely and then moved to the location where it will likely sit. 90% of these homes, despite the term mobile often being associated with them, will move once from a factory to the final place where they sit. And in 1976, there were rules implemented that basically said all of these housing units in the United States had to conform to a national code, which is unusual. Normally, housing is coded at the local level, but for these factory-built homes, to facilitate commerce across states, they were allowed to be coded at the national level. A mobile home is essentially the same thing, but it's a home that was produced before this 1976 set of rules was enacted. These are sometimes considered to be a bit of a concern because oftentimes there was very little regulation of these production procedures, and oftentimes the standard was very low. And much of the manufactured housing that's on the landscape today precedes this 1976 time. Okay, and I have here some images on the side here that are sort of emblematic, and I just want to point out with these images that this is a very diverse housing type, right? So, for instance, this home here is a manufactured home, but so is this home up above it. So, oftentimes people talk about manufactured housing, mobile housing, as though it were one sort of monolithic entity. They paint it with a very broad brush, but in fact, it's really quite diverse. And the framework, it's a very simple framework, I admit, but the framework that we've been using to try to understand vulnerability in this particular housing type is this concept of the manufactured housing gap. And it's a really simple idea. It's just the recognition that there's nothing inherently marginal about a home that's built in a factory first and then moved to a site. In fact, there are all kinds of good reasons to expect that a home that's built in a factory might be higher quality. You'll be able to produce it in the controlled environment of a factory, produce more efficiently and therefore at less cost. But the reality is that manufactured housing in the United States in particular is often this nexus, this point of connection between various forms of social, financial, health, and environmental vulnerabilities. The Federal Emergency Management Administration has 17 hazards that it looks at. And the housing type that is most often at the center of these hazards is manufactured housing, right? So what is it? How do we understand this housing technology that should be perfectly fine on the surface of it? How does it become this meeting point for all these different types of vulnerability and hazard exposure? And it's important for us to figure this out because there's a lot of people living in manufactured housing in the United States. There are 22 million people that live in manufactured housing in the United States. That equates to about 8.5 million units of manufactured housing, which is approximately equal to the total number of subsidized housing units in the entire country. So, in the United States, there are various forms of housing subsidy, relatively little direct provision of housing in the form of social housing, but there are various subsidy programs. And if you add all of these programs up, it equals about the same number of manufactured housing. And for the most part, manufactured housing lies completely outside of this. So it's sometimes referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing, okay? By and large, the populations that live in manufactured housing are poorer than renters or homeowners. So approximately 31% of people that live in manufactured housing parks, which is a particular arrangement of this housing type, are considered poor versus 15.5% of all renters, right? And then the number is, of course, much lower even for homeowners. And it's a population that's increasingly ethnically and racially apart from other housing types. So especially in farming communities, in amenity destinations, colonias, which are informal settlements within 100 miles of the US-Mexico border, and large Sun Belt cities. So San Bernardino, which is a metropolitan statistical area just outside of Los Angeles, between 2011 and 2019, the population living in manufactured housing that identifies as Hispanic has increased from 30 to 50%. And in Houston, which is the largest city for the prevalence of manufactured housing, that population has increased from 50 to 60% over the same period of time. So these are I'm just trying to give you a sense of the basic demographic trends in this housing type. I'm here based in Tucson, Arizona, which is where I've been doing most of my field work. And manufactured housing makes up a very substantial portion of our housing stock. So about 10% of our housing stock is manufactured housing. And there are 4 times as many units of manufactured housing as there are subsidized housing in Tucson. So when we're thinking about housing affordability in Tucson, oftentimes we are thinking about manufactured housing. Even though that's not often the central part of the conversation around housing affordability in the city. And again, we have a lot of this housing is also older. So I mentioned this pre and post 1976 form of manufactured housing. In Tucson, about 35% was placed on the landscape prior to 1976. So this is older housing built to a lower standard that is often very difficult to get financing to fix up. So there's a lot of housing inadequacy within this particular housing type. Okay, so with that sort of background on manufactured housing complete, I wanted to sort of share this sort of conceptual, very simple conceptual map for thinking about vulnerability. in manufactured housing. So what I've tried to do here is to represent urban space with housing units all over it, and then to think about how different forms of vulnerability intersect and compound each other and cascade. And the idea here is that at points of intersection between environmental, social, and financial vulnerabilities, we are going to see this gap, this manufactured housing gap, this gap between the promise and the reality of manufactured housing as a quality form of housing is going to be the widest. And what I want to do today is sort of emphasize two circles in this Venn diagram. Focus first on the financial reasons why manufactured housing is marginalized, or sort of at the center of various forms of vulnerability. And that's where I'm going to introduce this idea of real property supremacy. And then I want to focus on environmental vulnerability with the specific example of indoor adaptation to extreme heat, with this concept that we've been developing here with Karina Martinez Molina and Charles Misch, called home thermal security. Okay, so first, real property supremacy. The most basic definition I've been able to come up with for real property supremacy is the systemic elevation of real property, that is land, and all the stuff that's legally affixed to it, or growing from it. So structures that are legally affixed to the land underneath it, anything that you would extract from the ground in terms of mining or grow from the land in terms of agriculture, above other forms of property as the most privileged and protected form of home and home investment in the United States, right? And I think it's really important because when we're talking about manufactured housing, it's often assumed that the vulnerability of this housing type and the people that call it home is rooted in the constitution of MH, or manufactured housing, in law and policy as inferior to other housing types. And there's truth to that. I buy into that argument. That is an important argument. But I also want to shift from a discussion of the deficits of this particular housing type to the relationship between privilege and marginalization. Instead of asking how does the favoring of one form of property, in other words, I want to ask how does the favoring of one form of property marginalize and produce vulnerability in other forms of property, right? So basically what I'm arguing now is that the marginality of manufactured housing in US housing markets is also about the historical and systemic privileging of real property, okay? This is the sort of property that you can go to the bank and get a mortgage for. Typically, manufactured housing is personal property, not real property, and the financial markets, mortgage markets, are not as developed to serve this form of property. Okay. And here, in making this argument, I'm drawing on an emerging literature around critical macro finance, which is associated with Daniela Gabor and, to a certain extent, Adam Tooze, who's kind of a celebrity economic historian at this point, and the literature around financialization of housing. And one of the central insights of this literature is to recognize that financial accumulation is increasingly driven by the production of new asset classes. And by asset classes, I mean standardized products that investors from around the world can essentially invest in, right? And the production and protection of these asset classes is not neutral, right? Some asset classes are more favored than others by the state and have sort of a regulatory framework around protecting their value and favored by capital. And what I want to think about is what are the impacts of the non-favored forms of property and the places and people that call those properties home as a result of the sort of protection and elevation of real property or other types of asset classes, okay? And so what I want to push back against is this idea here, sort of featured here on the left of my screen, which is the idea that privileging one asset class means basically more funds will go into that asset class and essentially nothing will happen to the unprivileged asset classes. And I want to sort of point out that that's not actually what happens. when you privilege a certain asset class or a particular area of a city in law or policy, it not only attracts more new investment to that asset class, but it draws investment away from other places and asset classes, right? And as a result, these areas or these forms of property, but in the context of financialization, still need access to credit. And so this creates opportunity for new forms of financial actors to enter into that market. And my research and the research of others has shown that when that happens, it tends to be more informal and often more predatory, right? So not only are you creating a sort of hierarchy of advantage, but you're creating opportunities for new, more predatory markets to be created. I have a colleague, Ben Teresa at the University of Virginia, who talks about how exclusions from one market is market making for another market. And that I can clearly see in the manufactured housing industry. Okay, so how does this relate specifically to manufactured housing? It's important to recognize sort of in the United States, access to these so-called American dream of home ownership has been largely facilitated through financial markets. So in the United States, beginning in the 1930s, home ownership was expanded largely through various forms of subsidy to financial markets, creating secondary markets for mortgages, creating mortgage default insurance provided by the state. And at first, these sorts of subsidies were only available to white middle-class families. And sort of a key point of distributional and racial struggle in the United States has been around expanding access to these subsidies to home ownership. And so it's become this highly subsidized, highly protected and regulated form of property. Access to real property through mortgage markets has become highly regulated, highly protected, and highly contested. But other forms of property, as a result, have sort of fallen through the cracks to a certain extent. And they have been structured in law and culture as inferior to other forms of property and considered to be inferior forms of home and investment, denied the supports and protections that real property has experienced. And as I mentioned before, manufactured housing is mostly personal property, but 80% of it is personal property, right? So manufactured housing does not get any support from government-sponsored enterprises. These are the main ones are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the housing finance system of the U.S., but these are entities that essentially, when loans are made by mortgage lenders, these groups will come in and buy them so that they have more funds to loan out again. There are fewer protections for mortgagees, for borrowers in personal property markets, right? So disclosures about loan costs, the need for appraisals, and the process for foreclosure and eviction is different. You can basically just be dispossessed of your home in the same way as someone could be dispossessed of their car for not making a car payment. Municipalities often view manufactured housing, for a variety of reasons I don't have time to get into, as locally unwanted land uses. They're sort of pushed into less desirable parts of the city, often to their borders or to industrial or commercial areas. They're often ineligible for certain forms of subsidies. For instance, the low-income home energy assistance program in the United States is the largest energy assistance program in the United States. Oftentimes, manufactured home residents are not eligible for that. When there have been large efforts to sort of stabilize housing markets through various forms of crisis, whether we were talking about the subprime financial crisis in 2008 or more recently in the CARES Act, oftentimes renters and homeowners of real property were given substantial sort of I don't know if I want to use the term bailouts, but they were given funds to help or regulations to help prevent them from being pushed out of their homes. And for the most part, people in manufactured housing have been bypassed by those forms of legislation. Okay, so yes, manufactured housing has been sort of marginalized as other forms of home, other forms of property that are common as a form of home have been privileged in a variety of ways. Okay, I've more or less said all of this. It's hard, though, sometimes to think about discrimination in this context because, you know, there's no literature around discrimination by housing type or form of property. Oftentimes when we think about discrimination, we think about it as happening along demographic axes, right? And it's sort of largely been left out. Manufactured housing has largely been left out of the research on housing discrimination, credit access, and financial inclusion. And I'm trying to sort of rectify that and to sort of think about how it is that discrimination by housing type or by property class intersects with other forms of discrimination. Okay, so what are sort of the practical manifestations of this? As I said to you before, the privileging of one particular asset class or market tends to draw funding away from other asset classes and property types, and then create the market conditions necessary for more predatory actors to engage. And this is exactly what we see happening in manufactured housing, where the forms of loans that people need to get to purchase their homes are often, if they can get mainstream loans from financial institutions at all, tend to be what are called chattel loans, which are higher interest over shorter periods of time, and so much more costly. But probably much more common, at least this is what our research suggests, is that people are engaging in contract for deed. So this is essentially when the seller of the home holds onto the deed to the home until it's entirely paid. And if there are any violations, late payments or destruction of property along the way, the person who's making the purchase who lives in the home has very little recourse, predatory forms of financing that dominate this market and that are very poorly understood. And these are manufactured housing from the Tucson area that I've just pulled from Facebook, actually. And I just want to impress upon you that this was during, these ads were posted at a time when the average 30-year mortgage rate in the United States was around 3%. So when a typical mortgagee was able to go to a bank and get a 30 buying with, you know, maybe only 10 or even 5% down on their mortgage, people were being asked to put 20% down and pay 1% as an annual percentage rate, or even 25% annual percentage rate, or even being sold these uninhabitable homes for a small amount with the expectation that the home would be fixed up by the home buyer. So where here you have a situation where it's not really clear what the annual percentage rate is because it's not totally clear what the cost of the repair will be. So a lot of the risk is sort of shifted onto the shoulders of the purchaser. Okay. And these sorts of contracts are, these sorts of home loans, these sorts of housing contracts are not new in the United States. In fact, these were this type of lending was very common in African-American neighborhoods in the United States, where lenders had essentially excluded these groups from these markets. They were redlined out. So I want to sort of use the historical example of redlining to better understand what's going on in manufactured housing today. So when these housing subsidy programs were set up in the 1930s, the government was like, okay, we want to subsidize housing, but we don't want to subsidize the riskiest forms of housing because we're concerned about it costing too much money. So they had this organization go out, the Homeowners Loan Corporation go out and make maps of all cities, I think in the United States, over 40,000 people. And they would essentially rank all residential neighborhoods according to their level of risk. And one of the key factors in determining a high-risk neighborhood was the presence of African Americans or other racialized minorities or ethnic groups. Okay, so and these areas were not given mortgage insurance essentially. So it basically meant that, or state-sponsored mortgage insurance. So it basically meant that lenders would avoid these areas and go into other areas. And so what we have set up here is this exact pattern of privileging that I was talking about with some earlier slides, where new money would flow into these low-risk, mostly white neighborhoods, as I've tried to represent with these large black arrows. And it would also sort of suck investment away from these areas that had been coded in red or redlined, and then attract opportunistic, often predatory lending into those areas, right? Where you get those contract sales, where you get that seller financing with very high interest rates and high risk for the buyer. Now, this is, I think, a great sort of summary of the sort of conditions that were created as a result of these federal policies. This is from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's famous for writing a piece in the last decade on making a case for reparations based on these practices. So whites looking to achieve the American dream could rely on a legitimate credit system backed by the government. Blacks were herded into the sites of unscrupulous lenders who took them for money and for sport. Now, so hopefully this is all clear. But now I want to sort of make the connection back to climate vulnerability. And here I can sort of stand on the shoulders of some great research that's been coming out from some folks who have identified long implications of these redlining policies. What a number of articles have come out recently in the past couple of years have shown is that areas that were redlined, you know, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, today experienced elevated land surface temperatures. In other words, the urban heat island effect tends to be worse across almost all US metros in these redlined areas, right? So the question is, well, what is it that is allowing this connection between financial exclusion and financial predation to produce extreme heat vulnerability many years later? So there are a few factors that have been identified by these researchers. One is that divestment made redlined areas targets for urban renewal, so large-scale government projects for highways, for public housing projects that introduced essentially lots of concrete to these areas. Concrete traps the heat and produced elevated land surface temperatures later on. Or, you know, the suppression of property values and land values in the area attracted speculators, private developers who wanted to buy a cheap land, redevelop it and sell it at a higher price. And again, bringing in more of these heat retaining materials like asphalt, brick, concrete, etc. And I think there's definitely some truth to that, but I think that there's some problems with this. I mean, the causal mechanisms, I think, are still pretty unclear to me. So the first concern I have with this is that land surface temperatures are not equal to how individual households experience extreme heat. You know, it doesn't address sensitivity to extreme heat or the adaptive capacity in the face of extreme heat. So for instance, land surface temperatures in Scottsdale, which is a fancy neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona, are going to be much higher than in the middle of the summer than any place in Chicago. But it doesn't mean that people living in Scottsdale are more vulnerable to extreme heat. It almost certainly is not the case because people in Scottsdale have large homes with very effective HVAC systems, or they're willing to pay lots of money for air conditioning, right? So land surface temperatures does not equal extreme heat exposure, sensitivity, or lack of adaptive capacity. Second, these explanations sort of align the sort of micro processes by which vulnerability is produced at the household level. Oftentimes people experience extreme heat in their places of work, right? Because they have to be outside, or in their homes, because their homes are inadequately insulated, they don't have effective HVAC systems. And the reasons why people have to work outside, or their homes, they can't keep their homes cool, have very little to do with large-scale investments from urban renewal, or requires you to access credit from outside of your own personal networks, but you can't do so unless you pay exorbitant or predatory rates. Well, often means it means you don't make those investments at all, and then you become your home becomes increasingly inadequate and less able to cope with hazards, or your capacity to deal with future hazards is further eroded by getting into debt traps or other various forms of problematic relationships. Okay, so we're trying to use manufactured housing as a contemporary place where these types of dynamics are unfolding in real time in the present, to sort of better understand the connections between predatory financial relationships and forms of extreme heat vulnerability in people's homes, right? And when we're doing this, essentially what we're trying to do is to sort of connect these two different gaps. This manufactured housing gap that I was talking about, why is it that this, inherently non-problematic form of housing technology is this source of so much vulnerability? And the climate gap, which is this idea that the impacts of climate change are disproportionately and unequally felt by people of color and the poor in the United States. So how do these two gaps, this climate gap and the manufactured housing gap, overlap? And how can we use this idea of real property supremacy to better understand the way in which these two gaps intersect? Okay, and the specific project that I'm using to sort of understand this right now has to do with the heat that people experience in their homes in manufactured housing. And so I'm going to shift to that in the time that I have left. I'm going to try to do this somewhat quickly. Okay. So I'm working on this paper with Charles Misch and Karina Martinez-Molina, trying to identify novel metrics for identifying households that are thermally insecure. In other words, people that can't control the indoor temperature of their home. Okay, and the concept that we're using to capture this problematic set of relations is home thermal security, which is sort of a recognition that we know very little about the thermal conditions that people experience in their homes. Using remote sensing technology, we can get a pretty clear sense of these land surface temperatures, which is, I think, why a lot of this research has been focusing on land surface. Basically, the information is easily available so that we focus on that. It's much harder to understand this sort of secret and hidden spaces of people's homes. But that's actually really important. I just want to emphasize this. There are time use surveys done in the United States, and they suggest that people spend about 90% of their time indoors, right? And most of that indoor time is spent at their home. And when it's too hot outside, most people just adapt by moving inside, right? So I know this is going to sound like a bit of a paradox, but we're going to experience climate change by and large inside. We like to think about our indoor environments as being separated from our external environments. But the reality is that increasingly, as we move more indoors to escape the extreme heat that is outside, we are going to be living through climate change indoors. And so those indoor environments become increasingly important as the climate heats up. But we know very little about what's going on in people's homes, right? And so home thermal security is an attempt to sort of get our heads around these challenging sets of relations. And it's just the ability of a household to maintain a stable home thermal environment that's consistent with basic health, social, and financial needs. And the ability to control that thermal environment is influenced by all kinds of things. Of course, the temperature outside, heat exposure, the urban heat island effect, but also the structural conditions of the home, what kind of cooling system they have, how much insulation they have, but also what sort of financial resources they bring to bear, like how much can they afford to pay in terms of their electricity bill every month, that kind of thing. And also social connectedness. Do people have other places they can go when it's too hot in their home, right? Can they borrow money when they run out of money and there's still time at the end of the month and they need to pay their bills? So these are all things that the point is that I'm trying to make is that even though we're looking at something, this intimate micro space of the home, you can't understand that environment without making connections to broader macro processes. And I'm not just talking about, climate change, but I'm also talking about macroeconomic conditions, right? That have increasingly, in most parts of the world, shifted the responsibility for the management of risk onto the shoulders of individual households. Use the term that you want, but it's the term that gets used the most for this is neoliberalization, right? So to understand this, we need to understand both the sort of climate dynamics, but also processes of neoliberalization. Okay. Why should we study home thermal security inside manufactured housing? One, we know that many residents struggle to keep their homes cool. Older homes are really expensive to cool, so there's this pre-76 issue where insulation wasn't really required. We also know from our colleagues up at ASU who've been doing work in Phoenix that manufactured housing residents are overrepresented quite dramatically among people that die in their homes of heat-related causes. So manufactured housing in Phoenix represents about 5% of the housing stock, but in 2019, more than 27% of the indoor heat-related deaths occurred among people living in manufactured housing, right? And some of their calculations suggest that you're 8 times more likely to die of heat-related causes inside your home if you live in manufactured housing than if you live in another housing type, right? So this is a very heat-sensitive housing type. And we have a lot of people living in manufactured housing, often retirees, who are more sensitive to heat. So these are some of the reasons why we want to focus on manufactured housing to better understand this. So what we did was we went out and we did a pilot study actually right at this time last year. And we wanted to find people that were experiencing heat as a catastrophe, right? So this is a framework from Melissa Gardero where everyone experiences some discomfort from heat, right? Heat is an inconvenience. Heat is a manageable problem. But the populations that we really wanted to focus on are the people that were the most likely to be experiencing heat as a catastrophe, right? So that we could identify those populations that just could not keep their homes cool or couldn't keep them at the temperature they needed for health or for social needs, right? So we made sure that we had a range of ages represented, but we focused on lower income populations. The average income for our population was under 20,000, and that's less than 50% of the area median income, to give you a sense. We wanted to have gender representation, immigration status. We've heard lots of anecdotal evidence, we don't have good numbers on this, that undocumented populations tend to be overrepresented in manufactured housing. Linguistic diversity. I didn't do all of the interviews here. I relied on research assistants, but 11 of the 21 households were Spanish-speaking or Spanish-only households. Race, and then age structure. So age of the structure. So we wanted older housing again. Okay, so what we did was we went out and we did an initiation survey. So we collected all kinds of data about the households, but we also installed these temperature sensors in people's homes. And what we were able to get from this is these graphs. So hope you can see this. I know it's a bit small on my screen, but hopefully you can all see this very well. So this is each household's time temperature graph for 2 months. And the red line that runs parallel to the x-axis is the average temperature for the whole group. And the two vertical red lines represent the beginning and the end of a record-setting heat wave where we had 8 consecutive days in Tucson above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so what we recognized immediately is that there's a lot of diversity. Even though we were looking at all low-income populations, all low-income households that we thought would be experiencing heat as a catastrophe, there's a considerable amount of diversity in terms of the home thermal environments of this population. And so we needed to figure out a statistical basis for differentiating these households based on their home thermal security. Which ones were the ones that were the most thermally insecure, and which ones were the best able to control their thermal environments. And to do this, we used a technique called principal components analysis, which is, I'm not going to get into the technicalities around this, but essentially what you're able to do is you're able to use a bunch of variables and see which variables account for the variation in the data that you have most effectively. Okay, so that's what we did. We took an existing set of variables that had been used to understand the use of air conditioning. So this is another study some folks had used, and we applied it to the temperature data that we had collected. And what we found was that the groupings that this principal component analysis produced suggested that these variables were not very good at differentiating the population according to their ability to control their thermal environments. In other words, they were not variables that represented home thermal security very well. So what we had to do was develop a new set of variables that were better tailored to identifying variations across households related to home thermal security. And I'm not going to go into all the detail here because I know that I'm going over time. But essentially we did a visual inspection and we said, you know, is this household above or below average temperature for this group? Is there a trend in the temperature for this household going up over the period of the study when outdoor temperatures were increasing? Was there elevation during the heat wave? Right? Was there large day-night variation? And then we converted these qualitative observations into things that we could measure quantitatively. And then we redid the PCA, the principal component analysis. And what we found was that our principal component analysis was very effective at identifying households that had low thermal security. It was less good at identifying moderate and high thermal security, but it was 100% accurate based on our sort of pre-PCA assessments at identifying these low thermal security households. So that was really exciting for us. And I just want to give you some examples. So this in the center here is the time temperature graph for a control household. So this is a household where we outfitted it with temperature sensors, but there was no one home during the study. The HVAC system, the air conditioning system was not operating at all. And then these are the low thermal security households. And then these are the high thermal security households, right? So you can see here with the high thermal security households that there's very little day-night variation in the temperature. They stick to pretty close to the average. There's no elevation of their indoor temperature during the heat wave. So they are very clearly demonstrating that they can control the temperature of their home independently of what's going on outside. Whereas these folks cannot. And I just want to really highlight this, right? They have large day-night variation. They were elevated during the heat wave. The temperatures overall for these households were above average. And temperatures were often in excess of 110 degrees. We actually had one household where their indoor temperature, their average indoor temperature was higher than the outdoor temperature for the period, right? Now this has to do with the fact that we recording temperatures in May, and so you still get pretty cold nighttime temperatures in Tucson during that period of time. Okay, so I just wanted to share some interesting takeaways already. So one of the sort of assumptions of the literature around heat vulnerability is that it is very, very, very strongly correlated with the presence or absence of air conditioning. And while we did see a correlation between the ability to control indoor temperature and air conditioning, it was not as straightforward as we thought. There were low thermal security households that had air conditioning. Maybe the air conditioning didn't work very well. Maybe they couldn't afford to run it all the time, right? So there are all kinds of like mediating factors that influence whether or not air conditioning can support an adaptive strategy, an effective adaptive strategy to extreme heat. There are also examples where households with high thermal security did not have air conditioning. So there was one household in particular where they used an evaporative cooler exclusively and did not have an air conditioner. But their home was very well shaded. It was sort of set within an environment that meant that the thermal load they were dealing with was less. So this is really valuable information. Some households have air conditioning, but low thermal security. So essentially what we have concluded from this is that home thermal security is determined by a much more complicated set of factors than just your HVAC system, right? So it sort of proves the thesis that I was sort of laying at the beginning of this subsection, which is that you have to understand a much broader set of issues to effectively understand the environmental conditions that people experience in their homes, right? And here is the next step of this research will be unpack some of the very extensive survey and interview work that we did with these folks to better understand the dynamics that produce these complicated conditions in their homes. Okay, so I just want to close off now with a few concluding thoughts. One, housing, finance, and vulnerability to heat and other hazards related to climate change cannot be adequately understood in isolation, right? Oftentimes work on financial discrimination, housing adequacy, and hazard vulnerability exist in sort of silos. And one of the things we're trying to do with this work is to really bring those together in a we're not the only people doing this, but in a much deeper way. It also sort of begs the question of what is climate finance? You know, there's a lot of people talking about how we have to make huge investments in climate mitigation, management, and adaptation. And how are we going to get there without the dollars and cents, without the money to make that happen? And so there's been a lot of hand-wringing around how it is that we are going to get the financing we need to adapt to climate change. That's important. I think that's important. But that conversation tends to happen at the level of institutional investors, large financial institutions, and states. And what I think a lot of the work that I'm doing really suggests is that a lot of the adaptation to climate change is happening at the household level. And so when someone goes out and borrows money from friends or family to repair their home after a flood, or to get a new air conditioner because their current air conditioner broke down, that is climate finance as well. And it's really, I think it's a really missing piece of our understanding of what climate finance is. And I think we need to really broaden the umbrella of financial practices that we think of when we think of climate finance. It also highlights the role of history in producing present vulnerabilities and the role of informal practices in managing them, right? So when we're making investments in reducing the impacts of climate-related hazards, we need to do so in a way that acknowledges that part of the reason why people are experiencing disproportionate climate impacts today is because of histories of colonialism, racism, and other forms of discrimination and exclusion. And oftentimes I find that conversations around management and mitigation leave that out. And I think what this work shows, especially the stuff around redlining, is that past financial discrimination is present climate vulnerability. And we need to make those connect. We need to better understand those connections and acknowledge them much more effectively than we have. And that implies that climate finance also has to include a conversation around reparation. Reparation, when we're talking about the global debt situation, but also within nations where minority groups have been discriminated against. So I'll just stop there with a quick thank you slide. I've worked with a lot of people on this project over the years, more than I can represent on this, both funders, collaborators, research assistants, undergraduate interns, et cetera. So I'll just stop there. Thank you very much for your time. As is my custom, I typically take longer than I anticipate, but thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you, Mark. It was very interesting. It's not my specialty. I'm a historian of geography, so I tried to get as much as I could. If any of you here in the auditor here with me have any questions, go ahead. And I have one question from the social media. Is Adrian Bautistav-Levich, who says, hi, morning, question. What is the increment cost like on the ground, viviendal, I think on the ground housing in the USA? And another question, to what factor do you attribute inequality in housing services? And another one about your map, these areas in color, what is the index of security? Mark?
The first question, I'm not sure I understand what the question was. But in the maps that I was showing, there is not actually an index of security there. What the two colors were representing, and I should have explained this, is manufactured housing. Each dot was 10 units of manufactured housing on the landscape. And the one color represented manufactured housing that was titled as personal property. In other words, the home was owned and titled independently of the land it was on. And the other color represented manufactured housing that was titled as real property, so where it's legally affixed to the land. What accounts for differences in housing adequacy and quality in the United States? There are so many factors that I can't really give a comprehensive response. But one of the things that I think I'm really trying to put forward here is that a lot of the hierarchies that exist in the housing finance system in the United States have to do with the privileging of certain forms of property over others. In other words, I know this is going to sound somewhat ironic, but the protection and privileging of certain forms of property produces hierarchies that reproduce structural vulnerability. And then when it comes to developing indices, this is actually really, this used to be a part of a longer presentation, believe it or not, where I talked about another paper where we are developing vulnerability indices that are specific to manufactured housing. Social vulnerability indices often in the United States use the percentage of manufactured housing on the landscape as an indicator of vulnerability itself, which is highly problematic because it reproduces the prejudices and the stigmas associated with this housing as a form of inherently inadequate housing. And so what we wanted to recognize is that actually this form of housing can be a site of vulnerability, but it can also be provide high quality, low cost places for older people to age in place and for young families to get establish themselves in the housing market. So we wanted to come up with a new way to sort of identify profiles of vulnerability within manufactured housing, but it also differentiated this population and didn't treat it as a monolith. And what we've done is we've identified, using census microdata and another version of principal component analysis, logistic PCA, we've identified 4 profiles of vulnerability living in manufactured housing in Pima County, Tucson. Non-citizen, Spanish-speaking families with children, extremely low-income female-headed households, low-income female-headed household living in older housing, and then fixed-income older adults. So these are and we're actively mapping out these populations now. We're working on a submission to a journal called Housing Policy Debate that will be outlining the technique by which we did this and how our results differ from a standard sort of off-the-shelf social vulnerability index.
Thank you, Mark. Naxeli Ruiz, a very loved colleague in the Institute, says, congrats, great research outputs, and asks, where can we read your detailed methodological strategy? Particularly, how did you build your PCA? And
yes.
Another question from Maria del Rocio Castillo says, thank you for your amazing presentation. Which proportion of manufactured housing owners own the land where houses are settled?
These are really good questions. So unfortunately, we have not published all of the housing, the home thermal security work where we use PCA. That's under in prep still. We do have the index, the LPC, the logistic PCA analysis that I was just talking about, where we develop these manufactured housing specific vulnerability indices. That has been published in the form of a white paper, which I'm happy to share if Luz, you can share my email address. I'd be happy to share it that way. And where we go into detail about how we constructed that LPCA from census microdata, which is actually quite complicated, especially for LPCA, because LPCA is great because it allows you don't have to use continuous data, which allows you to use census data, but you have to convert all of your data into binary variables, which is kind of complicated and involves a lot of sort of value judgments. And so we're sort of still working that through. How did we build the LPCA for the home thermal security? We really stood on the shoulders of our collaborators up at ASU who had developed an R code for doing this LPCA analysis of temperature data. So we essentially borrowed that, used their variables, and tested whether or not they were effective at differentiating households according to home thermal security. We found that they didn't. And so we did that qualitative process of observing the temperature data directly and developing novel metrics based on those observations, rerunning the LPCA, doing a k-means cluster analysis, and fortunately discovering that it was those variables were very effective at differentiating those populations. So that, in a nutshell, I know it's not as much detail as perhaps you'd like, but that's what we did. What percentage of the MH population owns the land that their home is on? Okay, that's a tougher question than you might think, because if you just look at how much MH is titled as personal property, it's 80%. So 80% of the manufactured housing that's bought or sold in any given year averages around 80%. But sometimes someone will purchase a home as personal property and then put it on land that they own, but they won't go through the process of having it legally affixed to the land. So it doesn't become a part of the parcel that includes the land. So what percentage of the population is out there that owns the land and the structure independently? I actually don't know that. I don't know that, and it's actually quite difficult to get that information from the most obvious sources. which would be the American Housing Survey. So I don't know what that is overall, but one of the most common ways in which people, especially lower cost manufactured housing, one of the most common ways in which people live in it is in collective settings. Many mobile home parks is the common term, where you have a landlord who owns the land. People own their homes, but they rent the land that their home is on for a lot rent every month. So it's a sort of a split ownership where you rent the land, but you own the unit independently. And in cities, that's around 50% of the population.
Thank you, Mark. Another question, maybe the last one. Maria del Rocío Castillo Aja, how financiation of parks for manufactured housing will impact the house affordability and vulnerability?
This is such a good question. And manufactured home parks, which I just mentioned, have actually become kind of a darling asset class. You know, large institutional investors have been moving into this space. Investors who want to find a way that they can make money without doing much work have also been attracted to this. There's a famous investor who's made a lot of money off of manufactured home parks who's described this as running like a low-cost restaurant where the patrons are chained to the tables. And basically what that insight is reflecting is that oftentimes people who own their homes, this is the biggest asset they own. It's hard and expensive to move. So they're kind of stuck, but they don't own the land their home is on. And so the person who owns that land can essentially charge them whatever they want. And the person that owns and who has their home there is stuck paying those higher and higher rents. And institutional investors have discovered this reality and have moved in large numbers. And we're seeing much greater concentration in the manufactured home sector. And where large institutional investors have come in, they tend to jack up the rents. And so it's really this financialization of housing, and specifically manufactured housing, is really eroding manufactured housing as a source of affordable housing. That's very true. And you know, one of the paradoxes of all of this is that I talked about how it's so difficult for manufactured home residents to get financing to purchase homes in parks. Conversely, it's very easy for large institutional investors to get funds to purchase the whole parks. So there's a paradox here that implies that the collection of mobile home residents is a really good investment, but the individual homes and home owners are very poor investments. So this sort of unequal access to financial markets in the context of financialization produces a very problematic power dynamic, which is eroding manufactured housing as this source of affordable housing. And actually, this is under review at a journal right now, but that this specific issue of the financialization of manufactured housing and how sort of financial exclusion for the residents relates to the financialization of the parks is going to be coming up. So I'm working on that with. I'm happy to share. I'm happy to share it in its review form if you're interested.
Okay, Mark, thanks very much. It was very interesting. I learned a lot, and I think that our colleagues in the social media and here with me have learned a lot, and we will certainly read you if you send us the names of the journals where you have published, and I will share your email with Naxeli and whoever asks. I have, my email is on the website of the Institute, so so anybody can ask me. And it was an honor to have you here with us, and we certainly would like to have you here present, sharing this same space with us, and have another presentation as good as this one, and you can have seminars with our colleagues and organize that. So just ask, make plans.
I would love to do that. You know, one of my students who's doing this work on home thermal security is from Hermosillo, and one of the things that I think she's been wanting to do is some cross-border comparison around some of these issues. So yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation. I just dropped my email address, mkear@arizona.edu, into the chat. I don't know how many people can actually see that, but thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun, and I hope we can do this again in some way.
Yes, of course, you are invited. And I thank everyone here from the social media and here in Facebook and YouTube. And I am inviting you all for our next conference. Now I'll speak in Spanish, sorry. Les agradezco a todos los que nos acompañaron a través de las redes sociales, a través de YouTube y de el Facebook del Instituto de Geografía. Ha sido un honor tener al doctor Mark Kerr con nosotros, y seguiremos incluyendo a los profesores y colegas de la Universidad de Arizona en nuestra programación semestral. La próxima semana, el 24 de junio a las 12 tendremos la última sesión de este primer semestre del Instituto de Geografía, y en esta ocasión vamos a contar con una académica de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras del Colegio de Geografía, la doctora Patricia Gómez Rey, que es historiadora de la geografía como yo, y va a dar una charla titulada Para restituir a las mujeres en la historia, vida y obra de dos geógrafas mexicanas. Creo que va a hablar de más geógrafas mexicanas, no nada más dos, lo cual se puede advertir pues en las fotografías que están en el póster, que no sé si lo puedan proyectar, pero ya lo verán en nuestra página del instituto. Entonces les reitero mi agradecimiento por acompañarnos y espero que estén con nosotros el día 24 de junio en la última sesión de este semestre. Y le reitero también mi agradecimiento al Dr. Mark Kerr. And I invite you to join us in the next forum. It will be about the history of women in geography, and it will be in Spanish, so you can practice your Spanish. Thank you very much, Mark. Okay.
Bye now. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.